February 1945. A German Luftwaffe bomber soared over the frozen ruins of Budapest, its belly loaded with 500 kilograms of high-explosive ordnance destined to obliterate whatever remained of the starving Hungarian capital. The pilot, a decorated officer named Hans Richter, had flown 87 bombing missions across Europe, each one carving deeper scars into cities already bleeding from war. But on this mission, something inside him shattered. As he approached the target coordinates, Hans made a decision that would brand him a traitor to the Third Reich and condemn him to a firing squad. Instead of releasing bombs onto the skeletal apartment buildings below, he opened the cargo bay and dropped something else entirely. Flour, canned meat, medicine, bread wrapped in parachute silk. The people in the streets below, who had been hiding from the expected apocalypse, emerged to find manna falling from the same iron sky that had been raining death for months. The official record would call it a malfunction, a mechanical failure that caused the bomb release mechanism to jam. Hans Richter's commanding officer, Oberst Friedrich von Kleist, accepted this explanation because the alternative was unthinkable. That one of his most trusted pilots had committed an act of mercy in the middle of total war. But Hans knew the truth, and so did his co-pilot Kurt Becker, his childhood friend who sat frozen in the navigator's seat as the food packages tumbled earthward. Kurt said nothing during the flight back to base, his silence a fragile shield protecting them both from immediate execution. This was not a spontaneous act of rebellion. Hans had been planning this for 3 weeks, ever since he flew a reconnaissance mission over Budapest, and saw something through his binoculars that haunted him more than any battlefield carnage he had witnessed. A little girl no more than 7 years old was kneeling in the rubble of what used to be a school, trying to dig something from the frozen ground with her bare hands. Hans Richter was not supposed to care. He had been trained in the doctrine of total war, where cities were legitimate targets, and civilian suffering was an acceptable cost of victory. He had dropped incendiary bombs on Dresden, obliterated supply lines in Poland, and participated in missions that turned neighborhoods into crematoriums. The Luftwaffe had taught him to see targets, not people, to calculate tonnage and blast radius, not the number of children who would never see their 8th birthday. But the image of that girl in Budapest burrowed into his mind like shrapnel he could not extract. Her name was Maria Kovacs, though Hans would never learn this. She had been searching for her cat in the ruins when Hans flew overhead, and the fact that such innocence could still exist in the apocalypse he was helping to create broke something fundamental in his understanding of what he had become. The winter of 1945 was the coldest in Hungarian memory, and Budapest was dying. The Soviet Red Army had encircled the city in late December, trapping over 800,000 civilians and 30,000 German and Hungarian soldiers in a siege that would last 102 days. Food supplies had collapsed within the first 2 weeks. People were boiling leather belts to make soup, hunting rats in the sewers and grinding up wallpaper paste to bake into something resembling bread. The Danube River had frozen solid, cutting off the last supply routes. Typhus spread through the overcrowded shelters, the dead accumulated faster than the living could bury them, and the city began to smell like an open grave. Into this hell, the Luftwaffe continued to fly bombing missions, not to break the Soviet siege, but to destroy anything the Red Army might use when they finally conquered the city. Scorched earth, total war, no mercy. Hans had joined the Luftwaffe in 1939, swept up in the patriotic fervor that promised Germany would reclaim its rightful place among the great powers of Europe. He was 22 years old, the son of a schoolteacher from Bavaria, a young man who loved flying more than ideology. The Nazi propaganda had worked on him the way it worked on millions of others, by offering purpose, pride, and a chance to be part of something larger than himself. He believed in the mission, or at least he thought he did. 6 years of war had transformed that idealistic young pilot into something harder, more mechanical. He had learned to compartmentalize, to separate the act of pulling the bomb release lever from the consequences that followed. But Budapest was different. Perhaps it was the accumulated weight of 6 years of killing. Perhaps it was seeing his own reflection in the eyes of that starving child. Or perhaps it was the simple, terrible realization that he had become the monster his father had warned him about. The decision to load food instead of bombs required meticulous planning and extraordinary risk. Hans spent 3 weeks gradually diverting his personal ration cards, convincing Kurt to help him purchase black market supplies, and carefully timing his theft of medical supplies from the base infirmary. He told Kurt only what was necessary, and Kurt, who had known Hans since they were boys climbing trees in the Bavarian countryside, understood that his friend was crossing a line from which there would be no return. On the morning of the mission, Hans loaded the packages himself, working in the pre-dawn darkness while the ground crew slept off their hangovers. Each package was wrapped to survive the fall, each one containing enough sustenance to keep a family alive for a week. He calculated that if he distributed the drops across 3 city blocks, he might reach 200 people, 200 lives, measured against the thousands he had helped destroy. The mission briefing that morning had been routine, delivered by Oberst von Kleist with the same mechanical precision he used for every operation. Hans and 12 other pilots stood at attention in the freezing hangar, while von Kleist pointed at a map of Budapest with his wooden pointer, circling the industrial district near the Danube, where Soviet forces had established supply depots in abandoned factories. The objective was straightforward: obliterate the warehouses, collapse the roads, make the area unusable. Von Kleist emphasized that collateral damage was not a concern, that the Hungarian civilians remaining in the combat zone had made their choice by not evacuating when they had the chance. Hans listened to these words and felt nothing, which terrified him more than if he had felt rage or disgust. 6 years of war had taught him to turn off his emotions during briefings, to hear orders as pure information divorced from moral weight. But this time, standing in that frozen hangar, with his modified cargo already loaded, Hans felt the numbness crack. He was about to betray everything he had sworn to uphold, and the strangest part was how calm he felt about it. Kurt Becker had barely slept the night before, knowing what they were about to do. He had tried 3 times to talk Hans out of it, citing the obvious consequences: court-martial, execution, the destruction of both their families back home, who would be branded as relatives of traitors. But Hans had a way of speaking that made impossible things sound inevitable, a quiet intensity that Kurt had seen before when they were teenagers, and Hans decided they should steal his father's motorcycle and ride it to Munich. That adventure had ended with both of them in trouble but alive. This one would almost certainly end differently, yet Kurt found himself unable to refuse, unable to let his oldest friend walk into this alone. They had flown 43 missions together, had pulled each other out of burning aircraft, had shared a flask of stolen schnapps over the burning wreckage of Cologne. Loyalty, Kurt had learned, was a more powerful force than self-preservation. So he climbed into the navigator's seat that morning and said nothing when he saw the packages instead of bombs, just checked his instruments and plotted the course to Budapest as if this were any other mission designed to rain death on a dying city. The flight east took 2 hours and 17 minutes, crossing over the patchwork landscape of a continent, tearing itself apart. Below them, the earth was scarred with trenches, cratered roads, and the black smudges where villages used to stand. The Danube snaked through the terrain like a frozen artery, and as they approached Budapest, the devastation became absolute. The city was a geometry of destruction, its once grand architecture reduced to hollow facades and collapsed domes. Smoke rose from dozens of fires that had been burning for weeks, and even from 3,000 meters altitude, Hans could see the tiny figures of people moving through the ruins, like ants navigating a shattered anthill. The other bombers in their formation peeled off toward their assigned targets, and Hans followed standard procedure, banking toward the industrial district. His hands on the control yoke were steady, his breathing controlled. This was the moment. In approximately 90 seconds, he would either complete his mission as ordered, or commit an act that would end his life, but might save a few others. The bomb bay doors opened with their familiar mechanical groan, and Hans felt the aircraft lift slightly as the weight prepared to drop. Through the bomb sight, he could see the target area expanding below, a cluster of warehouses near a residential block that had somehow survived mostly intact. Families were sheltering in those buildings, he knew, mothers, children, old men, too stubborn or too weak to flee. The standard bombing pattern would obliterate 6 city blocks, turning concrete into shrapnel and people into statistics. Hans made a fractional adjustment to his approach, angling away from the warehouses toward the residential area, toward the place where he had seen the little girl 3 weeks earlier. Kurt glanced at him but said nothing, his face pale in the dim cockpit light. The release lever was cold under Hans's gloved hand. 6 years of training told him to pull it now, to complete the mission, to trust that someone far above his rank had determined this destruction was necessary. But 6 years of killing had also taught him that orders were just words, and words could be wrong. He pulled the lever, and the packages tumbled out into the winter sky. For 3 seconds, nothing seemed different. The aircraft rose as the weight released, exactly as it would have with bombs. The formation continued on course. But then Hans broke protocol, banking hard to the left to watch what happened below, and Kurt, understanding that they were already beyond the point of return, did not question it. The parachutes deployed, white silk blooming against the grey ruins like flowers in a graveyard. The packages drifted down in a scattered pattern across 3 blocks, and even from this altitude, Hans could see people emerging from cellars and shattered buildings, pointing upward in confusion and then rushing toward the falling supplies. One package landed on a roof and split open, scattering canned goods across the tiles. Another settled in the middle of a frozen street. A third caught on the skeletal remains of a church spire, before sliding down into the square below. It was chaos, beautiful and terrifying, and Hans knew that in approximately 6 minutes, when the formation returned to base and his commander demanded his bomb damage assessment report, his war would be over. The radio crackled to life with the voice of the formation leader, Hauptmann Dieter Wolf, demanding a status report from each aircraft. One by one, the other pilots confirmed successful bomb releases and reported secondary explosions, the proof that their ordnance had found flammable targets. When Hans's turn came, he pressed the transmit button and delivered his report with the same flat tone he had used on 87 previous missions. Payload released, target area saturated, returning to base. The lie passed through the radio waves unchallenged because the truth was unthinkable. No one in the Reich's military hierarchy could conceive that a decorated Luftwaffe pilot would sabotage his own mission to feed enemy civilians. The fiction held for exactly 43 minutes, which was how long it took for the formation to return to the airbase outside Vienna and for Oberst von Kleist to receive a confused telegram from German ground observers who had been monitoring the Budapest mission through binoculars from their position across the Danube. Von Kleist was waiting on the tarmac when Hans brought his aircraft in for landing, and the expression on the Oberst's face told Hans everything he needed to know. There would be no pretending this was a mechanical malfunction, no bureaucratic mercy that might allow him to quietly disappear into a punishment battalion on the Eastern Front. Von Kleist's fury was the cold, systematic kind, the rage of a man whose orderly world had been violated by the inexplicable. He ordered Hans and Kurt to report to his office immediately, not even allowing them time to remove their flight gear, and the 2 airmen walked across the frozen runway knowing they were walking toward their executions. Kurt's hands were shaking, his breath coming in short gasps that crystallized in the February air. Hans felt strangely peaceful, as if the act of defiance had lifted a weight he had been carrying for 6 years. Whatever happened next, he had done one thing in this war that he would not have to answer for in whatever judgment awaited beyond death. The interrogation lasted 7 hours. Von Kleist, joined by 2 officers from military intelligence, demanded explanations that Hans could not provide in any language they would understand. How could he explain that he had simply stopped being able to do it, that the machinery of war had finally ground through whatever moral insulation had protected his conscience? They asked if he was a communist sympathizer, if he had been recruited by enemy agents, if his family had Jewish connections that had turned him against the Reich. Hans answered no to every accusation, because the truth was simultaneously simpler and more complicated. He had seen too much death and decided to create a small pocket of life instead. The interrogators found this explanation insulting, as if Hans were mocking them with his simplicity. Von Kleist, who had known Hans for 3 years and had personally recommended him for 2 decorations, seemed most wounded by the betrayal. He had trusted Hans, had seen him as the embodiment of German military excellence, and now that image had shattered into something he could not comprehend. Kurt tried to take full responsibility, claiming he had sabotaged the bomb load without Hans's knowledge. But the lie was so transparent that it only made things worse. The interrogators separated them, and Kurt, under sustained pressure and the threat of torture, finally broke and confirmed what they already suspected, that Hans had planned the operation for weeks, and that Kurt had helped only out of misplaced loyalty. This confession sealed both their fates, though Kurt's cooperation earned him a marginally less harsh sentence. Instead of immediate execution, he would be sent to a penal battalion, where he would have the opportunity to redeem himself through suicidal combat missions. Hans received no such mercy. Von Kleist personally signed the court-martial order that condemned him to death by firing squad, to be carried out within 72 hours. There would be no appeal, no intervention from higher command. The Reich was collapsing, losing the war on every front, and it could not afford the luxury of tolerating traitors, especially traitors whose actions suggested that mercy was superior to duty. Hans spent his final 3 days in a concrete cell beneath the airbase, alone except for the guards who brought him water and stale bread twice daily. He was not tortured, not because of any particular kindness, but because there was nothing left to extract from him. He had confessed everything, had refused to implicate anyone else, and had shown no remorse for his actions. The guards, young men barely out of their teens, treated him with a strange mixture of contempt and curiosity, as if he were some exotic specimen of madness they could not quite categorize. One guard, a boy of perhaps 19 with a Bavarian accent similar to Hans's own, asked him late one night why he had done it. Hans considered the question for a long moment before answering that he had simply wanted to save someone instead of killing them, just once before the war ended, and whatever remained of his soul was beyond salvation. The guard nodded slowly, said nothing more, and never asked again. What Hans could not know, locked in his cell waiting for dawn and the firing squad, was what had happened in Budapest when those packages fell from the sky. Maria Kovacs, the 7-year-old girl whose image had haunted him, had been sheltering in the basement of her apartment building with her grandmother and 14 other neighbors when they heard the air raid sirens. The sound had become so routine that some people no longer bothered seeking cover, too weak from hunger to care whether they lived or died. But Maria's grandmother, a woman who had survived the First World War and the Spanish flu, still possessed the stubborn survival instinct that kept pulling her toward another tomorrow. She dragged Maria down the stairs just as the bombers appeared overhead, and they huddled together expecting the familiar thunder of explosions that would either kill them instantly or bury them alive under tons of rubble. Instead, they heard something different, a series of soft impacts like heavy snow falling from a roof, followed by shouting that sounded more confused than terrified. When Maria and her grandmother emerged from the basement, they found their street transformed into something from a fever dream. White parachutes draped across the ruins like enormous flowers, and people were running toward them with an energy that weeks of starvation should have made impossible. One package had landed directly in front of their building, split open from the impact, revealing canned meat, flour, dried beans, and medical supplies wrapped in cloth. Maria's grandmother fell to her knees and began to weep, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, because she understood immediately what this meant. Someone up there, in one of those machines of death that had been destroying their city for months, had chosen mercy instead of murder. The neighbors descended on the packages with desperate efficiency, dividing the contents with surprising fairness given their extreme hunger. There was enough food in that single package to keep their building alive for another week. Maybe 2 if they rationed carefully. Across 3 city blocks, similar scenes unfolded as approximately 200 people discovered that the sky was raining salvation instead of fire. An old priest, who had been preparing last rites for a dying woman in a makeshift hospital, found a package containing morphine and antibiotics that would save 12 lives. A mother of 3 discovered canned milk that would prevent her youngest child from starving to death within the next 48 hours. A teenage boy, who had been considering joining the Hungarian fascist militia out of sheer desperation, instead found hope in a sack of flour and decided to wait 1 more week before surrendering his humanity. These moments of grace spread through the neighborhood like ripples in water, and while the siege would continue for another 57 days and thousands more would die, Hans Richter's act of defiance created a pocket of possibility where none had existed before. The German ground observers who reported the incident to von Kleist had watched through their binoculars with complete bewilderment, initially assuming they were witnessing some new Soviet propaganda trick or a malfunction in the bomber's payload. Only when they saw people gathering the packages and the distinctive shape of food supplies being distributed did they understand what had actually occurred. Their report was clinical and precise, noting coordinates, wind conditions, and the approximate number of civilians who benefited from the drop. They did not speculate on the pilot's motivations because such speculation was irrelevant to their function as military observers. They simply recorded what they saw. At 1400 hours on February 20th, 1945, a Luftwaffe bomber designated Able 73 released an estimated 500 kilograms of food and medical supplies over a residential area of Budapest instead of the assigned explosive ordnance. The information traveled up the chain of command with the cold efficiency of German military bureaucracy, and within 6 hours, Hans Richter's fate was sealed. But something else traveled through Budapest that day, something that could not be measured in kilograms or recorded in military reports. The people who received those packages began to tell others about the miracle that had fallen from the sky, and the story spread through the ruins with the speed of desperate hope. Some dismissed it as a mistake, an accident of war that meant nothing. Others saw it as proof that not everyone fighting for Germany had surrendered their humanity. A few even speculated that the pilot had done it deliberately, though they could not imagine anyone being foolish or brave enough to commit such an act, knowing the consequences. Maria Kovacs, clutching a can of meat to her chest like a holy relic, told her grandmother that maybe the angels had not forgotten them after all. Her grandmother, more practical and less inclined toward divine explanations, simply said that sometimes one good person was worth more than 1,000 soldiers, and that whoever had done this deserved to be remembered when the war finally ended and people started counting the cost of all this madness. The execution was scheduled for dawn on February 23rd, 1945. Exactly 72 hours after Hans had been locked in his cell. The military tribunal had been perfunctory, lasting less than 30 minutes, with 3 stone-faced officers asking questions to which they already knew the answers. Hans had been assigned a defense attorney, a weary captain who went through the motions of arguing for leniency while understanding that the verdict had been predetermined. The charges were read in clipped bureaucratic language: willful disobedience of direct orders, sabotage of military operations, aiding the enemy, treason against the German Reich. Each charge carried the death penalty independently, and combined they formed an insurmountable wall between Hans and any possible future. He listened to his own condemnation with the same strange calm that had possessed him since the moment he pulled the release lever, and when asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he simply stated that he regretted nothing and would make the same choice again if given the opportunity. Von Kleist attended the execution personally, standing in the frozen courtyard with his hands clasped behind his back, while a firing squad of 8 soldiers assembled in formation. The Oberst's presence was not required by protocol, but he felt obligated to witness the end of a man he had once considered exemplary. Hans was brought out just as the sun began to break over the eastern horizon, his hands bound behind his back, his Luftwaffe uniform stripped of all insignia and decorations. He walked steadily across the courtyard, refusing the traditional blindfold, wanting to see the sky one last time before the bullets found him. The firing squad commander, a sergeant who had executed 4 deserters and 3 spies in the past 6 months, read the official judgment aloud in a voice devoid of emotion. Hans barely heard the words. His attention focused instead on a single bird flying overhead, a crow or raven making its way west away from the Eastern Front and the approaching Soviet armies. The mechanics of military execution were designed for efficiency rather than mercy. Hans was positioned against a brick wall scarred with bullet holes from previous executions, the morning light casting his shadow long across the frozen ground. The firing squad stood 20 meters away, their rifles loaded with a mixture of live rounds and blanks, so that no individual soldier would know with certainty whether his bullet had killed the condemned man. This was meant to ease the psychological burden of execution, though Hans suspected it was a fiction that helped officers sleep better, rather than the enlisted men who pulled the triggers. He thought briefly of his father, the schoolteacher in Bavaria, who had warned him about the dangers of blind obedience and tribal loyalty. He thought of Kurt Becker, sentenced to almost certain death in a penal battalion, but at least granted a few more weeks of life. He thought of Maria Kovac and the 200 others who had received his final gift, and he wondered if any of them would survive the siege to tell the story of the bomber that dropped food instead of death. Von Kleist gave the order to ready, and 8 rifles rose in unison. Hans took a deep breath of the freezing February air, and felt grateful that after 6 years of delivering death from above, he would at least die on solid ground, looking at the sky. The order to aim came next, and Hans could see the rifle barrels pointing at his chest, could see the young faces of the soldiers behind them, boys really none older than 25, caught in the same machinery of war that had consumed his own youth. He felt no anger toward them, no fear of the bullets. The strangest thought crossed his mind in those final seconds, that perhaps his entire life had been leading to this moment, to this one act of defiance that would cost him everything but might mean something to someone somewhere. The sergeant's mouth opened to give the final command, and Hans closed his eyes, not from fear but from a sudden overwhelming fatigue that made him ready for whatever silence waited beyond the thunder of rifles. The volley shattered the morning quiet, 8 rifles firing as one, and Hans Richter fell backward against the brick wall before sliding to the frozen ground. Von Kleist watched dispassionately as the execution detail commander approached to deliver the traditional coup de grace, a single pistol shot to ensure death, though the rifle volley had done its work efficiently. Within 10 minutes, Hans's body was removed from the courtyard, wrapped in canvas and buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the airbase cemetery, a traitor denied even the dignity of a named headstone. The official record would note his execution and the charges against him, but would carefully omit the specific details of his crime. It was too embarrassing to admit that a decorated pilot had chosen to feed the enemy rather than destroy them, too dangerous to let such an example spread among troops whose morale was already fracturing as the Reich collapsed around them. By noon that same day, von Kleist had drafted new security protocols to prevent any repetition of such sabotage, and by evening, Hans Richter had been effectively erased from the official history of his squadron. Kurt Becker survived his penal battalion assignment by exactly 11 days before a Soviet sniper's bullet found him during a suicidal assault on a fortified position outside Prague. He died thinking about Hans, about the flight over Budapest, about the choice they had made together that had seemed so clear in the moment and so impossibly complicated in the days that followed. Before he died, Kurt had managed to write a single letter to his sister in Munich, a letter that would not reach her until August of 1945, 3 months after Germany's surrender. In that letter, written in cramped handwriting on a scrap of paper torn from a ration book, Kurt described what Hans had done, explaining that his best friend had been executed not for cowardice or incompetence, but for an act of tremendous courage that the military had labeled treason. He asked his sister to remember Hans's name, to tell people when the war was over that not everyone who wore the uniform had been a monster, that some had fought against the machinery of death, even when it cost them everything. The letter arrived at a time when Germany was drowning in its own ruins, when millions of people were trying to process the enormity of what had been done in their name, when the true scope of the Holocaust was being revealed in photographs and testimonies that made the mind recoil. Kurt's sister, a woman named Greta who had lost her husband at Stalingrad and her son in the bombing of Hamburg, read the letter 3 times before she understood what it was asking of her. She was supposed to remember a man who had fed the enemy, who had disobeyed orders, who had been shot by his own side for showing mercy. In the immediate aftermath of total defeat, when Germany was occupied and divided, and everyone was desperate to forget their complicity in 12 years of horror, remembering Hans Richter seemed like the most dangerous thing she could do. So she folded the letter carefully, placed it in a tin box with her other precious documents, and said nothing to anyone about the pilot who had chosen humanity over duty. Meanwhile in Budapest, Maria Kovacs and her grandmother survived the siege, though barely. The The food from Hans's packages had sustained them through the worst of February, but March brought new horrors as the fighting intensified and the city became a street-by-street battlefield between German defenders and Soviet attackers. By the time Budapest finally fell on April 13, 1945, more than 38,000 civilians had died, and the city looked like the surface of an alien planet, cratered and burned and unrecognizable. Maria's grandmother died of typhus 2 weeks after liberation, whispering with her final breaths about the miracle of the parachutes, about the bomber that had brought life instead of death. Maria, now an orphan at 7 years old, was taken in by distant relatives in the countryside, and she carried with her 2 possessions, a photograph of her parents and an empty tin can that had once contained meat from a package that fell from the sky. The story of Hans Richter should have ended there, buried in an unmarked grave in Austria, forgotten by a military that wanted to erase any evidence of dissent, unknown to the people he had saved who never learned his name. For decades, that is exactly where it remained. The Cold War divided Europe, making it nearly impossible for stories to cross the Iron Curtain. Greta Becker died in 1968, taking her brother's letter to her own grave, the tin box lost when her apartment building was demolished for new construction. Maria Kovacs grew up in communist Hungary, became a schoolteacher herself, married and had children, but never forgot the day the sky rained food. She told the story to her students sometimes, though she presented it as a folk tale or a dream, rather than a historical fact, because in the Soviet-controlled education system, suggesting that a German soldier had shown mercy complicated the approved narrative of fascist evil and communist liberation. The resurrection of Hans Richter's story began in 1991, 2 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when a German historian named Dr. Klaus Zimmermann was researching Luftwaffe records for a book about military discipline during the final months of the war. Zimmermann discovered a brief reference to an execution at an airbase outside Vienna in February 1945, notable only because the charges included the unusual phrase, unauthorized delivery of supplies to enemy civilians. Intrigued by this cryptic language, Zimmermann began investigating, tracking down surviving members of Hans's squadron, interviewing elderly residents of the area around the former airbase, and eventually finding the unmarked grave that had been discovered during construction work and catalogued but never identified. What he uncovered was a story so extraordinary that he initially assumed it must be exaggerated or mythologized, the kind of redemptive tale that survivors tell themselves to make sense of senseless tragedy. Dr. Zimmermann's investigation took him to Budapest in 1992, where he interviewed dozens of elderly survivors who had lived through the siege. Most had vague memories of chaos and starvation, their recollections blurred by trauma and the passage of nearly 5 decades. But when he mentioned the date, February 20th, 1945, and asked about packages falling from German bombers, something remarkable happened. 3 different people, interviewed separately in different parts of the city, told him virtually identical stories about parachutes blooming in the sky and food landing in the streets. One of them was Maria Kovacs, now 64 years old, a retired teacher living in a small apartment overlooking the Danube. When Zimmermann showed her the military records he had uncovered, when he told her the name Hans Richter, and explained that this pilot had been executed for what he had done, Maria began to cry with such intensity that the interview had to be paused for 20 minutes while she composed herself. Maria told Zimmermann that she had spent 47 years believing the food drop had been either a miracle or a mistake, never imagining that a specific human being had made a conscious choice to save her life at the cost of his own. She retrieved from a drawer the battered tin can she had kept all these years, the physical proof that the memory was real, and she held it in her trembling hands while describing how that food had kept her and her grandmother alive long enough to survive until spring. Zimmermann photographed the can, documented her testimony, and asked if she would be willing to go public with the story. Maria agreed immediately, saying that if someone had died to save her, the absolute least she could do was make sure his name was remembered. Within 6 months, Zimmermann had compiled enough evidence to publish an article in a respected German historical journal, and the story of Hans Richter began its slow journey from forgotten grave to public consciousness. The article attracted immediate attention, not just from historians but from journalists who recognized the narrative power of a story that complicated the simple binaries of war. Hans Richter was neither a resistance hero who had secretly opposed the Nazi regime from the beginning, nor a loyal soldier who followed orders without question. He was something more difficult and more human, a man who had participated in atrocity for 6 years before finally reaching a breaking point and choosing to do one good thing even though it would destroy him. This moral complexity made some people uncomfortable, particularly those who preferred their World War II narratives to have clear heroes and villains. There were letters to the Journal accusing Zimmermann of Nazi apologism, of trying to rehabilitate the image of the Luftwaffe by highlighting one aberrant act of mercy while ignoring the thousands of bombing missions that had killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Zimmermann responded to these criticisms with careful nuance, arguing that remembering Hans Richter was not about excusing the Luftwaffe's crimes, but about understanding the full spectrum of human behavior under extreme conditions. He pointed out that Hans's execution proved how exceptional his choice had been, how completely it violated the military culture in which he operated. The Reich had killed him precisely because his act of mercy threatened the entire logic of total war. The dehumanizing machinery that required soldiers to see enemy civilians as acceptable casualties rather than as children who deserved to eat. By remembering Hans, Zimmermann argued, we honor not just one man's courage, but the possibility that even in the darkest systems, individual conscience can still assert itself. The debate raged in academic journals and newspaper opinion pages throughout 1993, and through it all, Maria Kovacs continued to tell her story to anyone who would listen, her testimony anchoring the historical record in lived experience. The turning point came in 1994, when a German television network produced a documentary about Hans Richter, combining Zimmermann's research with Maria's testimony and newly discovered footage of wartime Budapest. The documentary aired on the 50th anniversary of the siege, and more than 4 million people watched it, including several elderly veterans who had served in the Luftwaffe. One of these viewers was a man named Otto Brenner, who had been a ground crew mechanic at the Vienna Air Base in 1945. Brenner contacted the television network with information that Zimmermann had not uncovered. He had been one of the mechanics who serviced Hans's aircraft, and he remembered seeing Hans loading packages into the bomb bay in the pre-dawn darkness of February 20th. Brenner had assumed at the time that Hans was conducting some kind of authorized supply drop, perhaps for German troops trapped behind Soviet lines. Only when Hans was arrested did Brenner understand what had actually happened, and the memory had haunted him for 5 decades. Otto Brenner's testimony added crucial details that transformed Hans Richter's story from an isolated act into something more deliberate and premeditated. Brenner recalled that Hans had been unusually quiet in the weeks leading up to the mission, spending long hours alone in the hangar when other pilots were drinking or playing cards. He remembered Hans asking technical questions about weight distribution and parachute deployment, questions that seemed odd at the time but made perfect sense in retrospect. Most significantly, Brenner revealed that he had found a scrap of paper in the cockpit after Hans's arrest, a handwritten note that Hans must have dropped accidentally during his final flight. The note contained a single sentence in Hans's handwriting. For the children who should not have to pay for our mistakes. Brenner had kept this note hidden for 49 years, terrified that possessing it might implicate him in Hans's treason, but the documentary had finally given him the courage to come forward and add this evidence to the historical record. The note changed everything. It proved beyond any doubt that Hans had understood exactly what he was doing, that this was not a spontaneous emotional breakdown, but a calculated moral decision. Zimmermann incorporated Brenner's testimony into a second article, and later into a full-length book, published in 1996, titled The Bomber Who Chose Mercy, The Hans Richter Story. The book became an unexpected bestseller in Germany, striking a nerve in a nation still grappling with its wartime past and the question of individual responsibility within totalitarian systems. Reading groups discussed it, universities assigned it in courses on ethics and history, and suddenly Hans Richter became part of a larger conversation about the choices available to ordinary people living under extraordinary evil. Some readers found inspiration in his story, proof that moral courage was possible even when the cost was absolute. Others found it deeply troubling, a reminder of how many others had not made that choice, how many had continued following orders all the way to the end. Maria Kovacs was invited to Germany in 1997 to participate in a ceremony honoring Hans Richter's memory. The city of Munich, Hans's birthplace, had decided to name a small park after him, and Maria was asked to speak at the dedication. She stood before a crowd of several hundred people, now 70 years old, holding the same battered tin can she had preserved for 52 years, and spoke about what it meant to be saved by a stranger. She explained that Hans Richter had never known her name, had never seen her face, had no way of knowing whether the food he dropped would reach anyone at all. He had acted purely on faith that human life had value, that mercy was worth pursuing, even when the entire world seemed committed to cruelty. Maria's voice cracked with emotion as she described her grandmother's final words about the miracle of the parachutes, and when she finished speaking, the silence was so complete that you could hear the wind moving through the trees of the park that now bore Hans Richter's name. The ceremony attracted media coverage across Europe, and the story reached new audiences who had never heard of the pilot who dropped food instead of bombs. Among those watching the news coverage was an elderly woman in England named Sarah Morrison, who had been a British intelligence officer during the war. Morrison contacted Dr. Zimmerman with information that added yet another layer to the story. British intelligence had intercepted and decoded German military communications about Hans's execution, and Morrison had been one of the analysts who read those intercepts in real time in February 1945. She still remembered her reaction upon learning that the Luftwaffe had executed one of its own pilots for feeding civilians, remembered thinking that if Germany was killing its own soldiers for showing mercy, the war must be nearing some kind of moral apocalypse. Morrison's testimony provided independent corroboration of the entire story, linking German military records with Allied intelligence intercepts and Hungarian survivor accounts into an unassailable historical fact. By the late 1990s, Hans Richter's story had achieved a level of public recognition that would have been unimaginable a decade earlier. Historians used it as a case study in moral courage and individual agency within oppressive systems. Ethicists debated whether Hans's 6 years of participation in bombing campaigns negated the moral value of his final act, or whether redemption was possible even for those complicit in great evil. Psychologists examined his decision as an example of moral injury and the breaking point where conscience overrides conditioning. And ordinary people, particularly in Germany, saw in Hans a complicated kind of hero, not someone who had always been good, but someone who had finally chosen to be good when it mattered most, even knowing it would cost him his life. The story resonated because it acknowledged the difficulty of moral choice, the reality that most people are not purely good or evil, but somewhere in the messy middle, capable of both terrible things and tremendous courage. The legacy of Hans Richter extended far beyond academic discussions and memorial parks. In 2003, the German Bundeswehr, the modern German armed forces, incorporated his story into their ethics training curriculum for officer candidates. Military instructors used his case to teach a fundamental lesson, that following orders is not an absolute moral defense, that soldiers retain individual responsibility for their actions even within hierarchical command structures. The choice to include Hans in official military education was controversial, with some senior officers arguing that highlighting a case of disobedience, even noble disobedience, could undermine military discipline. But the reformers won the argument by pointing out that modern democratic militaries needed soldiers who could think critically about the orders they received, who understood that some commands should never be followed regardless of the consequences. Hans Richter became the example they used to illustrate that principle, his execution serving as a cautionary tale about systems that punish conscience and reward cruelty. Maria Kovacs lived to see this transformation, though she never fully reconciled with the irony that the same institution that had killed Hans was now using him as a moral exemplar. She continued to speak publicly about her experience until 2008, when declining health forced her into retirement. Before she stopped giving interviews, she established a small foundation that provided scholarships to Hungarian students studying conflict resolution and peace studies, funded by donations from people who had been moved by her story. The foundation's mission statement explained that it existed to honor both Hans Richter's sacrifice and the countless unnamed victims of the Budapest siege, to transform one man's act of mercy into ongoing educational opportunities for young people who might prevent future wars. Maria died in 2011 at the age of 73, and her obituary in the Hungarian press identified her as the child who had been saved by the German pilot, her entire life story now inseparable from that February day in 1945. The physical evidence of Hans's act gradually became artifacts of historical memory. The battered tin can that Maria had preserved was donated to the Budapest History Museum, where it sits in a glass case alongside a photograph of parachutes falling over the city, Zimmermann's book, and a copy of the note found in Hans's cockpit. The unmarked grave outside Vienna was finally given a proper headstone in 2006, 61 years after his execution, with a simple inscription: Hans Richter, 1917 to 1945, Luftwaffe pilot who chose mercy. His name was also added to a memorial in his hometown in Bavaria, listed alongside other local casualties of the war, though his entry includes the notation, executed for humanitarian action, to distinguish his death from those killed in combat. These physical markers serve as pilgrimage sites for people interested in stories of moral courage, and visitors regularly leave flowers and handwritten notes expressing gratitude for his example. Kurt Becker's story also found belated recognition. The letter he had written to his sister Greta was eventually located by Zimmermann during his research, having been preserved by a neighbor who had cleaned out Greta's apartment after her death. The letter was published in full in Zimmermann's book, and Kurt was posthumously recognized alongside Hans as someone who had chosen friendship and conscience over self-preservation. Unlike Hans, Kurt had not originated the plan and had participated more from loyalty than conviction, but his choice to help rather than report his friend still represented a form of moral courage that deserved acknowledgement. A small plaque in Prague, near where Kurt fell in combat, now commemorates both men and the choice they made together. The inscription notes that they were best friends who died separately but should be remembered together. Two young men who briefly stepped outside the machinery of war to assert their humanity. The broader impact of Hans Richter's story can be measured in unexpected ways. Teachers in multiple countries now use his case in classrooms to discuss ethics, obedience, and moral responsibility. Novelists and playwrights have adapted his story, each version emphasizing different aspects of the narrative. A documentary filmmaker in 2015 interviewed the children and grandchildren of the people who received the food packages, collecting dozens of testimonies from families who owed their existence to Hans's decision. One woman whose grandfather had been saved by the food drop calculated that Hans's act had led to the births of 43 direct descendants across 3 generations, an entire extended family that would never have existed if he had followed his orders and dropped bombs instead. She broke down crying during the interview, overwhelmed by the realization that her entire life, her children's lives, all traced back to one man's choice to disobey. So what do we do with a story like this? What do we do with Hans Richter, a man who spent 6 years helping to destroy cities, who participated in the machinery of Nazi Germany's total war, who followed orders without question until suddenly, inexplicably, he didn't? The easy answer would be to call him a hero and move on, to use his final act to erase the complexity of everything that came before. But that would be a betrayal of the truth, and worse, it would miss the entire point of why this story matters. Hans Richter was not a hero who infiltrated the Luftwaffe to sabotage it from within. He was a true believer who became disillusioned, an ordinary man who was shaped by propaganda and nationalism and the seductive promise of purpose, who killed because he was told it was necessary, and who finally, after 87 missions and 6 years of war, saw a starving child and could no longer pretend that orders justified atrocity. His story is important precisely because he was not always good, because his moment of moral courage came after a long history of moral failure, because it proves that redemption is possible even for those who have participated in terrible things. The question that haunts this story, the question that should haunt all of us, is why Hans Richter was the exception rather than the rule. Thousands of pilots flew similar missions over Budapest and dozens of other cities. Tens of thousands of soldiers participated in the systematic destruction of civilian populations across Europe. Most of them never reached the breaking point that Hans reached, never chose mercy over duty, never risked everything to save strangers. Were they morally inferior to Hans? Or was Hans simply the statistical outlier, the one person in 10,000 whose conscience finally overrode his conditioning? The answer matters because it shapes how we think about individual responsibility within oppressive systems. If Hans was uniquely courageous, then his story is inspiring but ultimately irrelevant to most people. But if Hans was ordinary, if the only thing that separated him from his fellow pilots was a single moment of moral clarity, then his story becomes a challenge to all of us. What would you do in that cockpit? When would you say no? I think about Maria Kovacs, 7 years old, digging through rubble looking for her cat while bombers circled overhead. I think about how close she came to being a statistic, one more child killed by high explosives, in a war she had no part in starting. And I think about how one man's decision gave her 73 years of life she would never have had, gave her children and grandchildren who exist only because Hans Richter valued their potential existence more than his own survival. There's something profound in that calculus, something that challenges our comfortable assumptions about heroism and villainy. Hans saved maybe 200 people with his final act, but he had helped kill thousands before that moment. Does the math work out? Can one good act balance years of evil? I don't have an answer to that question, and I don't think there is a clean answer. What I do know is that those 200 people deserved to live, and Hans gave them that chance when no one else would. The story of Hans Richter forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the systems we build. It reminds us that good people can participate in evil when the evil is bureaucratized and normalized, when it comes dressed in the language of duty and patriotism and necessary sacrifice. It shows us that moral courage often comes too late, after irreparable harm has been done, and that redemption is costly and incomplete. But it also demonstrates that it's never completely too late to choose differently, that even within the most oppressive systems, individual conscience can still assert itself if we're willing to pay the price. Hans Richter paid the ultimate price, and while his death didn't change the course of the war or prevent the continuation of atrocities, it changed everything for the people whose lives he saved. That has to count for something. That has to mean that his choice mattered, even if it came after so many choices that didn't. Here's what I want you to take from this story. You are not powerless. No matter how overwhelming the system, no matter how normalized the cruelty, you retain the capacity to choose differently. The cost of that choice might be everything, as it was for Hans Richter, or it might be much smaller. A social cost or a career cost, or simply the discomfort of standing against the crowd. But the choice exists always, in every moment. The question is whether you'll recognize the moment when it arrives, whether you'll have the courage to act when acting means losing everything, whether you'll be the person who drops food instead of bombs, even when the entire machinery of your world demands otherwise. Hans Richter's story is not just about one pilot in one war. It's about all of us, about the daily choices we make between comfort and conscience, between following orders and following our humanity. And it asks us, across 80 years of distance, a question that never stops being relevant. When your moment comes, what will you choose?